So a bit on your research, those who have joined in just now. So Siddharth is actually currently based in School of Business and Management, Queen Mary, University of London. And his research is about understanding the dynamic interplay between capital, labor, and nature in the production of seafood in India. And to quote Siddharth, actually, in his words, which I liked a lot, he's trying to look rationally into how capital appropriates nature and exploits labor, but also how nature resists commodification and labor resists exploitation. Such well, truly nicely poetic way you have given it in your profile. I loved it. So with that, I'll just welcome you again on this session, and thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining in, and let us start this. So how it all started, if I ask, what was your first interaction with the sea, if I would say so, which got you inside the marine?
Thanks, Shivam, for the introduction and for setting this up. And thanks everyone else as well for being here. I mean, this is the first time I'm talking to anybody about my PhD. You know, when I was in conservation, I used to talk a lot. But since then, I've gone quite quiet and I kind of like stay in my head a little bit. So this is kind of like been exciting to come out and speak a little bit about it as well. I mean, I think the relationship with the sea for all of us comes in different ways and formats. You know, I'm going to be 41 next month, and I started working when I was 18. So, you know, in a formal capacity as an adult, working with the sea was my first like long-term engagement. I used to work in the Merchant Navy. And so interacting with the sea in a way came from those voyages across the oceans and spending 9, 10, 12 months at a time, you know, on a ship. But then before that, we all have our experiences of, you know, going to the beaches or, you know, going to a place that you experience the sea from the land and, you know, see its vastness and immensity. But for me also, I come from a family where my grandfather was in the Merchant Navy as well. So when I was quite young in my life, he had still not retired and he was working, and he used to work for the NIO and used to be based out of Goa, actually. On a ship called Gaveshni, which no longer exists, but it was until very recently in commission, and it used to do oceanographic surveys, and he was the captain of the ship there. So I think once we had all gone to Goa and spent time on the ship, and it was the New Year's, and I remember, you know, there's a celebration at sea, which usually is like the foghorn of the ships go off at midnight, and, you know, the youngest person on the ship rings the bell, which is on the front of the ship, for 12 times to like count down the midnight. So I remember like those kind of things as being interactions with the sea, because that was actually being at sea. It was at anchor, but you were not on firm land. So it was living on a ship. And so, yeah, that was probably my first experience with the sea that I recall as a, you know, experience.
With your father that time. And you carried, and what actually, you know, motivated, we'll come to that, our PhD stuff, but I'm just trying to see your final, how you landed to the PhD. So what actually motivated to get into this Merchant Navy ships and this work you did for 10 years?
I mean, I did go through the process of after 12th standard applying for engineering, or trying to apply at least. I didn't get grades good enough to be able to get into an engineering college, or I remember my parents even got me the IIT joint entrance exam books, and, you know, I tried to study them and all, but it was very clear that mathematics and physics and derivation integration was not my strength. I mean, I did poorly in maths very much. But I think my parents also were kind of open to the fact that I might not do the engineering doctor kind of role. And so I had an aunt who used to work for a shipping company as a secretary to somebody who was a big shot in the company. And, you know, so we used to get these calendars from container companies, you know, annual calendars, or at Diwali, you get a book that says Costco Shipping Line or something like that. And then with my grandfather being at sea, obviously, some of his stories were about sailing from Southampton to New York, or, you know, there was this famous blast that had happened in Bombay. I mean, it's still one of the world's worst shipping disasters. where a World War II ship that was a cargo carrier, exploded, and the Queen's gold kind of scattered all over Colaba. And he was on that ship, the ship behind it. And he had just joined sea on that day. So he took a Tonga to Dadar and then took a train and went back to Pune because he was so scared that, this thing had happened. So there were all these stories also about the sea. And so when it became very clear that I was not going to be very academically inclined towards going to, those academic routes, I think doing something that was more practical and skill-based became, I was also very a distracted child. I would move around quite a lot. I had very low concentration, but I was physically quite active. Like my father used to run a water supply agency. So I used to work with him quite a bit. I was quite physical and like we used to offload trucks, load trucks. So my parents, I think, definitely saw that I was physically quite like I could do work. And so Merchant Navy came out of that really, like family history plus bad academic performance plus maybe an aptitude to do something that was more practical than academic. And it's funny because my mother still jokes that I'm doing a PhD, which seems to be the very opposite of everything that I was when I first went to sea. But anyway, that's how I ended up like thinking that I'd go to the Merchant Navy and ended up going.
And it doesn't matter actually how bad you might be telling that you were, but I think many of us actually who are actually passionate about doing stuff in sea would still be feel jealous of you, the kind of work you have done, and you keep on telling it was bad, but for others I think it would have been dreamy life for sure. Um, Coming to the another intersection, like I was reading about your work, like when I was in my bachelor's, I did my bachelor's in microbiology from Delhi University, and we had a course in environmental studies, and a book is written by Rag Barucha. So in that, we had some environmental disasters, and in there was one oil spill, which is Exxon Valdez. You must be aware of that, which happened in Alaska, and that completely changed my perspective. And I was like, I want to do something in conservation in marine life. And from microbiology honors, I completely changed to, I did my master's in marine biology. The same way I was reading yours that why you left your merchant ship, that you were born in Bhopal, and one nice day on its, I think, 25th or 35th year of that Bhopal gas tragedy, you realize that you are carrying the same toxic chemicals that once was the cause of one of the biggest tragedy in India. So how was that moment for you? I think that is the
Um,
place where you
yeah,
shifted.
a very
Uh,
interesting shift for you as well. And I think we all have these moments where something big that is very abstract from our reality kind of
yeah.
ends up affecting us and it has a profound change where something, and I think like similarly, you read about the Exxon Valdez and you think about Alaska and you think about how did it happen? And, those kind of things happen at different times. Um, pretty much as you said it, I joined the Merchant Navy. I worked for 5-6 years on forest product carriers, and from there, kind of, I shifted to working on oil and chemical tankers. Um, and you know, these are like most oil and chemical tankers, especially the chemical part, are quite toxic. Some of them are quite lethal as well. So you end up having like self-contained breathing apparatus, chemical suits, and you make these voyages. And it was quite routine almost when I was younger, 25, 26. It was like a challenge to be able to do that. Until this one voyage, of course, in 2009, which was the 25th anniversary of the Bhopal gas tragedy. And we were carrying a cargo for, not for the same company, not Union Carbide, but to Texas, where Union Carbide and all these chemical companies are based. And it was a gas, the methyl isocyanate, MIC, which is essentially completely without smell, completely without any kind of color, and very, very lethal. I mean, overnight in Bhopal, it killed thousands of people. And since then, many more have had like intergenerational effects of it. And the crew, obviously, who had been working in chemical tankers for much longer than I had, said they wouldn't load the cargo. And I, of course, being a young officer and feeling like, the alliances then were, of course, stronger towards ship owners because they pay you. So as a young officer with another person, we kind of put on the suits and loaded the cargo. And then during the cross voyage across the Pacific, it kind of like the news started coming in of the 25th anniversary because it was quite big. And we would get these email news. One day you would get, each day you would get a printout of the news. And, it was the 25th year of the Bhopal. And it kind of like got me thinking about what I was doing, not in the sense of, at that point in time, not really bigger questions, but more whether I wanted to continue to be in this realm of work, which obviously paid and gave you independence, but also had a darker history, kind of just the beginning realization of that kind of thing. So I think that got me thinking about what I wanted to do. And soon after that, I started thinking about where else I could use my skills for, which was, to repurpose it to other jobs. And that's how I found conservation work at sea, which was to say, okay, I have the skill of being at sea, of, being able to handle ships. Where else could it be more useful? And so that's how I shifted to Sea Shepherd. And that was in 2011. It still took me a year and a half to make the shift, but that's how it happened.
Yeah. I always wanted to hear from you because reading that, like, actually that kinds of like, resonate with my thing. So now I really, got connected to that story. And actually, today I was talking to my friend that today we are going to have this session with Siddharth and how this Bhopal gas tragedy had this big impact on his career. So, would you believe one person told me, like in Kochi, there is headquarters of CMFRI, it's a Fishery Research Institute in India. So, there is one lady sits there and she has lost his eyes, and the person told me she worked in that, near that
Oh.
factory, and she lost the eyesight during that. Some problem happened during that incident, that Bhopal gas tragedy. So I was like, this is like, we are just talking, and this dots just get connected like that. So coming to our thing, then how you got in touch with Sea Shepherd after this 10 years of job and completely inside of conservation, and how you got in touch with Sea Shepherd and got your way.
Um, I mean, for those who don't know, I'll just quickly just explain also what Sea Shepherd is. So Sea Shepherd Conservation Society is an American-based kind of conservation organization, but it's more activisty in the sense that they are more interested in direct action rather than advocacy or legal work and things like that. And since the 1979 is when they were founded, the form it has taken is to take a bunch of people who are like-minded, put them on a ship, and go after crimes at sea, and mainly wildlife crimes. So whaling, illegal fishing, pirate fishing vessels, things like that. And they've been fairly successful and have been quite high profile, etc. as well. But anyway, I came across them because they had been going to Antarctica for 6 years by the time I found them, against the Japanese government's research whaling program, which kind of sends 5 ships to the Southern Ocean Whale Sanctuary, which is designated under the kind of International Whaling Commission, IWC. And they were doing these actions saying, Japan's whaling was illegal. They became quite famous. And they were part of a Discovery show called Whale Wars, which was essentially an American reality television, typically made for somebody who would sit on their couch and have like fast food and want to watch something that is exciting. So it was not, but it became quite popular. And so I was on another ship and I was reading a National Geographic magazine, and I found an ad for Sea Shepherd in the National Geographic that said Whale Wars so and so, and it was quite an epic photograph. It was a big ship with a harpoon on the top, and then there's a small boat, and there's somebody from the Sea Shepherd throwing we used to throw these glass paint bottles of red color, so that in photographs you could tell they're killing whales and there's red blood, so those kind of things. So there, but when you look at it as a photograph from yourself being at sea, it looks like Like, wow, like, look at that. And I could, and it said, like, looking for volunteers and things like that. So then when I got off the ship, I did some research and I sent them an email. And the funny thing is, they didn't reply to me for a couple of months. And then when the crewing person got back to me, they were, because I said, I have a captain's license, I've been working at sea for 10 years, and I can come and volunteer at short notice, because I didn't know it was a career change. I thought I would just go and get some excitement in my life. And, I was bored on the merchant ships in a way. And they thought, how you get these scam emails? Like, the Prince of Nigeria wants you to transfer 200 million. They were like, it sounded too good that somebody with actual skills wanted to come and work for the organization. But anyway, that's how I ended up going to Sea Shepherd. And I went literally for 3 months, but I ended up staying for 5 years over there. It just became full-time work after a while.
Yeah, and this reminds me one of the incidents you were sharing with Ranveer, that with a whale calf, is it? That the eye contact you had, that just imprinted in your head. So can you just a little bit, just give that glimpse of that again? Like, how was that experience to you? And-
I mean, I think, like, my articulation keeps changing as we grow. So I'll use something new to kind of talk about it. I was recently listening to this podcast. It's called The Green Dreamer, and it's like this activist, public funded podcast on alternative ecologies and, people doing a lot of work. And it's a very interesting podcast. And there's somebody who works with whales and whale sounds. And they were asked, why do you think that whales are important to you and their sounds are important to you? And, their reply was that, whales, in a way, are the ancestors of us, in a way, in the natural world. Of course, we've evolved and all of that, but they are history in themselves. And the amount of time that they've been in the oceans, and that their sounds are now changing, and their songs are getting, different decibels, talks to us about how they are viewing the world change for them. And I think in that way, they reflect to us what we are, our place in the world, how recent it is, how impactful it is, what it would mean to look at the oceans from the whale's point of view, in a way. And I think encounters with animals that are bigger with us, with megafauna, obviously there is a narrative around it, and I agree. Butterflies and microorganisms and maybe COVID, invisible viruses, are just as profound. But when you look at wildlife documentary, and so when you actually end up meeting a whale for the first time at close proximity at sea, in the backdrop of icebergs with some birds flying around, it's a very unreal moment of realizing your place on the planet, so as to say. It's maybe similar to the first time you go to a beach, or you go to the mountains, and you see the expanse out there, and you realize there's more to the world than you saw. And I think as an adult, that moment was similarly a much bigger moment than just meeting the eye. It was kind of telling a lot of stories about yourself, and quite reflective in that way. And I think that's why I remember it. And maybe in the words of what the person said in the podcast, I think that's a better way to kind of think about it. Yeah.
Definitely. And actually, you explaining that moment actually just had, had a big impression on my imaginations also. So I really wanted to ask you that. And after that, like, you worked for 5 years there, and then, if I'm remembering correctly, you started your own work in labor rights conservation, if I'm protection
Yeah.
and all. So how was
Yeah.
that? Like, from conservation to the labor right laws and mm, in that area.
I mean, it's all again connected. So one of my last campaigns with Sea Shepherd was with an illegal fishing vessel, and we kind of like ended up chasing it for 110 days, and it was a long time. Like, it became like a family member, that ship. You don't usually see ships for so long, but we knew it. We knew the crew members. We had been taking photographs of them. There was obviously like rivalry because it was an illegal ship and we had obstructed, but it became so familiar. And what they did at the end of their campaign was that they sank their ship to make an insurance claim. So suddenly one morning, the boat started, like, it stopped moving, and then it started, going over on one side, and crew started coming out of the ship in life rafts.
Mhm.
And, as is protocol, you don't let anybody die at sea. So we went and picked up the people, and they were on the ship. And, the crew was all Indonesian, and then the officers were Spanish. And so there was this clear like divide between them. And uh, it kind of brought home the
Mhm.
idea of who works at sea. And through the campaign, of course, this had been building because we had been in touch with some labor activists in Indonesia. Because obviously we didn't want to endanger the crew in our campaign. We wanted to make sure that they could get home. It was mainly the owners of the boats who were running the illegal operations, not the crew, though they are the easier targets. But we wanted to make sure that. So even with picking them up and rescue rehabilitation, I was in touch with the Indonesian government, in touch with the fisheries minister. When they got repatriated, got called over by the minister for a press conference to kind of sit together and talk about this whole campaign, because by then in Indonesia also it had become a big thing that a lot of their nationals were working in industrial fishing boats and were working under quite exploitative conditions. And, to the point where they could just be abandoned in life rafts. So had we not been around, things could have been a lot worse.
Mhm.
So, and, then it became, by then, I think it was important for me to realize also that Sea Shepherd's work was not aligning with where my politics were moving. It had been a good transition from work at sea to, really looking at the oceans and giving my skill to something different. But it was still a conservation organization, which was still very focused on a certain kind of Western activism that is forceful, that is powerful, that maybe has its space in certain contexts, but maybe not in all contexts. And they were definitely going down a direction I was not comfortable with. And so with this campaign and these kind of shifts happening, I also used it as an opportunity to kind of shift out and move to working on labor, which I thought was more interesting. Um, Not interesting, was more important, because it was the people at sea who were actually working, and all illegality, etc., stemmed from working conditions, and it was important to address them. So that's when I went over to Indonesia for a couple of years. It wasn't very successful. I think I was naive in thinking that I'd be able to transition into a space where a lot more people had been working for a long time, and that your skill in one area doesn't guarantee a skill transfer into another area. But it was very interesting. We did a couple of studies which were quite deep, but again, it was not with a deep plan. So that only lasted for a couple of years until 2017, when I had to give that up as well and not pursue it any longer.
And was it that time that you wrote on your Twitter handle, tired of conservation?
I think earlier than that, probably in 2015, 16. But similarly, I mean, with Western academics in the business school, I also realized that there was a lot of
Mhm.
power in terms of who wanted to control what and how you were being treated. And, our visions were conflicting in where I wanted it to go and where they wanted it to go. And so it just, I felt like there was a lot of my labor and a lot of the work that had been done that became used for something that it was not intended for. And so I think, yeah, maybe around then there might have been a rant. I used to rant quite a lot. I don't anymore, but
We all do.
Um, could you could you talk a bit more in detail about your campaign in Indonesia and why it didn't like work out, or why you had to give that up? And what are the kind of issues that migrants at sea they face today, and what we could do?
yeah, yeah. I mean, just to give a disclaimer, I don't think those conditions transfer over to India. So, since most of our audience is from India, I mean, this is just a setting of industrial fisheries. And later, if there was time, I could talk about some of the things in India as well. But, so for example, a lot of industrial fishing, so and so, that we talk about is typically a fishing trip that lasts for about 6 months, 3 to 6 months. So a fishing boat will be at sea for all of those 6 months. They usually don't come back to land for about 3 years, sometimes up to 5 years. What will generally happen is that after 3 to 6 months, a refrigerated vessel will meet them at sea. They will refuel them with food, fuel. If any crew is needed, they'll give a couple of crew members to them, and they'll collect the fish. And they'll go around in a particular part of the ocean for about a week, 2 weeks, where all of the boats that have been fishing will give their fish to this refrigerated vessel, and that comes back to land. It gets processed, enters the markets, etc. And so typically an Indonesian, and to some extent Cambodian, Myanmar, a few Filipinos, fishers will kind of work for between 3 to 5 years at sea. Once they've left, they won't see land. Generally, working hours are between 18 to 20 hours long. And the conditions vary, but they are worse on long line boats, which are mainly for tuna, a certain species of tuna. So skipjack and albacore are more purse seine caught, but a couple of the yellowfin and some of the other tunas, big-eyed tunas, are more long line caught. Sorry, we've got a question from somebody. I'll let. Oh.
What happened?
Oh, I got a direct message. I don't know, Shivam, you can, like, do we take questions now or at the end? But I'm also very happy to leave my Twitter handle or email if somebody wants to get in touch. I'll just type it out now so that if anybody has to go later, they can just email me if they're looking for anything related to academic advice, etc.
Yeah, I think one person needs this. Can I ask, please? Way too confused. Yeah, I think you can.
Yeah. So generally it's quite grueling working conditions, and the boats are not very big, but they will probably put out about 100 kilometers of fishing line every day, and they'll roughly have about 10,000 hooks which are baited, and a lot of it is manual work. So the line goes out, each hook as it goes out, so 10,000 hooks, you have to put a piece of squid or a piece of small fish on it, like a mackerel that goes out, which the bigger fish will eat. The line will soak for 2, 3 hours, 4 hours, after which you have to haul in 100 kilometers of line. Then you clean it out, the fish, you head it, gut it, it goes into the freezer, and it goes out again. And they do that continuously. So, it's very, very long working hours. And obviously, this kind of work can only be possible if there's a very exploited workforce that is being paid less, that can be made to work so much. And generally, therefore, the people who are on those ships will come from backgrounds where they have very little avenues of work, where they're also making this choice to go to sea, but find themselves duped through agents and owners and, in conditions that they were not necessarily told they'd be working for. And usually there's a very high rate of accidents. So, for example, generally in industrial fishing, it is the world's most dangerous job. I mean, the loss of fingers and the loss of limbs and the death rates are higher than any other occupation in the world, both seafarers and industrial fishing. So it's quite dangerous work. And there's a certain group of people who obviously get taken for this work, and it's all from Southeast Asia. I don't know, I mean, I have a friend who's working on this now, but there are probably cultural elements to control, why certain groups end up in certain jobs, and why Indians are not working in this fishery, for example. I mean, there's different questions about why that happens. But at the same time, these are also some of the most lucrative fisheries in the world. So you have the big corporations that get this fish through the refrigerated vessels on their land, and they do the value addition. These are the sashimi grade, the sushi grade kind of tunas, which are obviously multi-million-dollar companies that control a lot of this high value. So wherever you see exploitation, you're automatically also going to see big capital on the other side of it, profiting off this exploitation. And so Indonesia was interesting because when you end up working with workers, you also get an insight into what's happening on the other side. And unionized workers, workers demanding better pay, workers who are better organized, obviously end up denting the competitiveness or the profits of the big corporations, which then ends up affecting ecology and reducing and bringing change in what happens. And so it was that moment of moving away from pure conservation to linking labor and ecology together, to say that, working conditions is perhaps a socially better way to get into the ecology question, rather than just going down the ecology way and maybe not caring so much about what the fallouts are, which I think happens a lot with conservation models from the West, whether that's conservation areas, marine protected areas, pure ecology-based approaches, etc. So I think that, and the reason it failed, I mean, I think I can talk about a few things, but I think one of the main reasons it's failed was because I myself was not ready for what it meant to do this work. I think 7-8 years later, I can be better placed to kind of talk about it. But it was a good introduction to the politics of the seafood industry. Long before people with good intentions got in to try and change the working conditions, big corporations with governments had already got in there to try and influence the narrative in their direction, which meant big money, big NGOs had already begun to move into that space. And so it makes it very hard then as an individual to try and get into that space. You obviously get shunted out because you're not prepared to take on what's in front of you. So I think that was the main reason why that initiative really failed. Yeah.
Okay. And having this thing in background, like you went through all this. So is it during this time you realize that, I mean, how this PhD thing came in your mind, that you have to, was it this time period that you got inside this PhD?
No, not really. I mean, this was in 2017.
Okay.
Sorry. And the project, so I quit Sea Shepherd in 2015, 16, 17, I did work in Indonesia. In 17, I burnt my fingers there, and I thought I would come and work in India because it feels like, that was the next place to go. And, Debashish, who's the president of one of the unions who's joined our call, I met people like him, and he has been very influential in the last few years of my life, which is to change that even further, that thinking from taking it at that industrial global level to bringing it down to the context of where you're working in, which is to say, how does that look in India? Do those same approaches work? If you have a traditional, artisanal, historically community that's been connected with the sea, then, where do they fit into the labor ecology question? Because they're neither labor, but they've got a deep connection with the ecology. And India, again, has had a deep history of organizing with the fish workers movement. So I think that was the next process of unlearning even what I thought I had learned. And during that time, I decided to do a master's program. So that was the first time I said, okay, because I hadn't gone to college. I had done all these modular courses online, and I had done like short professional degrees, and I had done a distance education bachelor's through IGNU, Indira Gandhi National Open University, in something called nautical sciences. So I qualified for a master's, but I realized when I was doing this work in Indonesia that I actually had no information or like skills to be able to place this in a structural situation of like development, underdevelopment, agrarian transitions, informal labor. Like I had none of that language because of having worked at sea. And so I decided to do a master's in development studies to be able to like get informed about some of those things. I think that was useful. Then I came back in 2019, 20, 21, and through the master's as well, I was working with the fish workers movement. I still do in a much reduced capacity, but it was to look at livelihood issues. It was to look at matters of rights of small-scale fish workers, to kind of like develop that articulation in our work through their articulation of connection to the sea, what it means to have that connection with the sea that's quite different from mainstream conservation, from urban Indian ideas of conservation as well. And I think that then developed at some point into a PhD for multiple reasons. I think one of them was that during my master's, I met my PhD supervisor now, who has been working in a lot of these questions of big capital and industrial fisheries for a long time. And I really felt that his work was important and influential for me at that point in my life, having met and read him, to kind of really think about how, as a researcher or how, as somebody who's interested in seafood, you just don't look at a group of workers or labor, but you also try to develop skills to engage with capital. And so I was quite taken by that idea. And so my PhD as well focuses not on small scale fish workers. It doesn't focus on workers in the seafood industry. Obviously, they're a part of it, but my main kind of group is big capital. So owners of big seafood companies, big traders, owners of multiple big boats, a group that I find really we don't speak too much. There's a lot of great research that happens, and a lot of that research is very important. And there's a lot of it that has helped in a lot of ways. But I did find that even in my work with Debashish and other people, that we were perhaps not as informed about who were the big groups, what were they doing, what were their relationships with the government, why were they doing what they were doing, and what could we do to maybe challenge that a little bit. And so the PhD really came out from working here, but also meeting my supervisor. I think it has also been informed by other life circumstances. So, for example, from, you keep hearing in the social justice lens about if you're upper caste, if you're a male upper caste person, who do you study? Who do you write about? My sister's queer, and in conversations with her, as somebody who's not queer, the question is not so much about homosexuality. The question is more about why are heterosexuals the way they are? Why, so it shifts your focus to a different group. And I think that also influenced the decision, which is to say that if most bureaucrats, if most seafood companies are Brahmin, Baniya, where a group that I belong to, then, I'm also accepted in those groups to come and speak to them. And so access and understanding who is invited into those rooms is important. But at the same time, that access also should be critical. And so going in there and asking questions. And so the PhD really came out of a shift from moving from ecology to labor, and then saying, maybe it has to shift even further. And so labor and ecology are central as the driving politics of why one does things for changing. But maybe it's not only relying on them to be the sources of information or them as being the main mobilizing group. It's shifting the focus a little bit to more powerful groups, knowing that they get by. I mean, just as an example, and I'll pause there, last week, there's a big scandal that has broken about the shrimp industry in India, using exploitative working conditions, and there being conditions of forced labor and, bonded labor. A lot of the workers have been documented by these American groups as being Dalit or Adivasi or migrants coming from agrarian settings where, climate change or debt, etc., has forced them to migrate into the informal economy. And, because it's my area of work, I've been following the news. I mean, the entire shrimp industry in India has remained unquestioned. The Ministry of Commerce has come out and said, the ministry, we have robust safeguards. The Seafood Association has come out and said, this is a witch hunt, it's not, but which is fine. I mean, that's the job. If it's the truth, it has to be done. But obviously, there were some 500 interviews that had been done over a 3-4 year period. There's a whistleblower who worked in one of the big shrimp companies and released undercover footage and audio recordings. So there has to be some truth, or at least there's enough urgency to, but there's nothing. No journalists have access to them. Nobody from the government, has questioned them. They themselves, of course, will scramble to American consumers and American buyers because that's where the pressure is from. But it highlights this point that, capital in seafood industry really works under the radar of most research. And so I think I wanted to use my PhD as a way to investigate that a little bit. And that's where the PhD came out from.
Okay. and you landed to a PhD. Um, and before I actually jump into seriousness of the PhD thing, I'll just ask, how are you feeling about your PhD? How it is going?
I mean, I seriously, I say this, and a lot of people say I'm the only person who says this, but I think it has been a most interesting journey, and it's been challenging. It's been a lot of learning. It's also opened up so many windows of curiosity and intellectual stimulation, which I think are important as part of the PhD. But they've also been connected to a lot of real life kind of interactions about understanding the world a little bit better of seafood, which I think is important. It kind of helps me go back and think about the work that I do with the fish workers groups about, what are some of the ways and avenues of work that we take ahead. So yeah, I'm in my third year now, and the UK PhDs have to finish in 4 years. So I have about 16 months before I finish. So I'm going back to London in May, where I have to be based out of till I finish and writing up. But just a few weeks ago, I finished all of my field work, which went on for a whole year. I started in March last year and ended in March this year. And it was between Andhra and Karnataka, and it's been, so I frankly do not have any hesitations about going into a PhD. I think it's been really important personally for me to be a part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, field visits are always, I think, amazing if you are quite passionate about your PhD or any kind of work for that matter. And coming to that field visit, as you are talking about your work, so in you have mentioned Karnataka and Andhra coast. So these are your study sites, and I am just curious how
They
you
are.
came. Yeah.
So, because I was looking at capital, I wanted to look at areas which could represent economically mighty sectors as a way to kind of, because obviously then they penetrate to links in neighboring states and networks with the government and industry associations. And so I wanted to look at where seafood was economically significant. And so it's on the Andhra coastal districts looking at shrimp farming. And in that East and West Godavari districts, and East Godavari now has broken up into 3 more districts. So it's those 4 districts which are the main field sites for shrimp. And it's Karnataka mainly looking at mechanized trawlers out of Mangalore and Malpe harbors, which are the 2 harbors and account for almost 70% of the state's catch. And Karnataka, because they have the biggest trawlers, so as to say, in the country, but they also have the surimi industry and the fish meal, fish oil industry. So almost 70% of fish meal, fish oil production is based out of Karnataka. And so it was to look at this idea of the sea as in ecological decline, but how capital was profiting off it through surimi, fish meal, fish oil, and then, of course, some high value mackerel, cuttlefish, squid kind of industries in that. And then it was to look at the links to shrimp, which is a 40,000 crore industry, makes up for 90% of India's seafood export revenue, but is essentially based on fish meal, fish oil, which comes from the West Coast through trawlers and, very low value bycatch, juvenile species, etc., etc. And to kind of look at this linkage of 2 sectors and how they are connected to each other across 2 parts of the country, and how one ecology, which is marine and more natural, gets commodified into something that becomes an input for something that's in a farm that's more standardized and a monoculture that then gets exported abroad. And to kind of like maybe look at these 2, like across land and sea, so as to say how business strategies make this transformation in producing seafood that then gets exported and is of value to capital, but then what does it mean for the ecology? What does it mean for certain other actors like workers, but also fish worker groups, small scale fish worker groups who live on the coastline and obviously see the impacts of trawlers, but also see the impacts of effluents, etc., that come out of shrimp farms, and to kind of like try and place all of that in some kind of communication with each other.
Okay. And you're like exactly they are just land apart completely. So you move on to you go to the lending centers and collect the data.
Yeah, so my research is mainly qualitative, so it's interview based. I'm not doing quantitative data because there is a lot of quantitative research, especially the government institutions do a lot of quantitative studies on fish landings and marine landings, and CMFRI and local fisheries departments collect a lot of census data. A lot of it is quantitative, and so I really wanted to look at power relations and social relations in what do people do, why do they do what they do. So it was mainly interviews. So in Karnataka, it was based at the harbors. So mainly going at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. During fish landings, trying to meet with boat owners, auction agents, purchasing agents in those hours, and then slowly shifting it with follow-up interviews. Some would say come in the afternoon, some would say come after the auction, going to fish meal plants, surimi plants in the afternoons, trying to meeting people in their headquarters, so meeting somebody in Bangalore because their office is based out of here. So that was the Karnataka side. And in Andhra, it was mainly based on shrimp farms. And so visiting farms through, like, I had a methodology to and a sample size to look at which farmers I wanted to meet, what kind of land holdings they would have. And so like trying to do some mapping and some ground truthing, and then meeting shrimp farmers mainly, but then also processors, purchasers, input agencies for feed and etc., to try and also look at the value chain. But my main focus was on farmers in Andhra and boat owners in Karnataka, because they are the ones who directly kind of interact with nature, so as to say.
I think someone's
Yeah, Mr. Vipin Kumar. Yeah. Yeah.
You were talking about that you got into the PhD because you wanted to explore like who controls, like who are the big groups in Indian fisheries. Could you just elaborate on that? Like who are the, like just talk about the Indian fisheries sector a bit.
I mean, it's quite drastically different on the two sides. In shrimp, for example, it's a mix of domestic capital and multinational corporations. So, for example, you do have the CPs, which is Thai. Then you have Thai Union, which is obviously Thai-based. You have Cargill, which is an American private big company. So they are there in different sectors. But interestingly, you also have a big domestic kind of capital, which is much bigger, in fact. So you've got Avanti, you've got Apex, you've got Devi, and I'm just taking names because these are kind of known to people who are looking at seafood. And then you have some big trading groups from like Kader Exports from Bombay. You have Choice Scanning, which is in the center of one of the labor scandals that has broken recently, from Kerala. But Andhra is definitely the epicenter of both fish feed and fish exports. And a lot of the fish kind of big players there are domestic players. A lot of them are former big agricultural landholding people. So there are two big caste groups, the Kapus and the Kammas. And the Kammas are the kind of entrepreneurial ones from the four coastal districts of East, West, Krishna, and Guntur, mainly East, West, Godavari. And, it's interesting that in the 1920s, there was an anicut built on the Godavari because it used to flood and there used to be cyclones all the time. And after that, in 1929, 30, there was the American Depression and you had the tobacco prices collapse. And so with the anicut and the irrigation and tobacco coming to India, a lot of the Kamma groups started, growing tobacco. Then they became affluent through tobacco. They shifted to cotton, they shifted to rice, then they shifted to shrimp. And for shrimp, they moved out to becoming fish feed owners and fish exporters and fish processors. So kind of a very entrepreneurial agrarian group that has moved out of agriculture and is quite embedded in the business through their transnational networks. They're also in transport, in quarrying, in the IT sector, in education. It's not just shrimp, they're a group that is quite entrepreneurial across. In the seafood, in the trawling side, it's quite different. It's a mix of traditional fishers, the Mogaviras, for example, from Karnataka, who have become trawl boat owners. But there's also the counterpart of the coastline of Tulunad, which is the Beari Muslims, who are in the south of the coast, and then the Shettis and the GSPs, the Gaur Saraswat Brahmins. So there's a mix of different groups who have been historically been powerful, but then there's also new groups which have come in with fisheries development. And there's kind of a more competitive mishmash of different capitals investing over there. And then with the fish meal, fish oil, and surmi industries, there's more like trading capital from Gujarat and other parts that has come into Karnataka and has invested capital. But then also they have links to other kinds of fish meal, fish oil. And so China is a big fish meal, fish oil importer, for example, of Indian fish meal, fish oil. So then those trading oil networks, the Gujaratis had a big trading network across the Indian Ocean with East and West Africa. Some of those networks have got activated because you have like the sardine run of East Africa, which acts as an input when the Indian monsoon season comes in. So it's a lot more, as you would think, an older kind of trade networks that have entered into fishing. So yeah, it's a little bit more fragmented. There are no big names like you have in the shrimp side. And again, my PhD, I'm not at the data analysis part, but it looks at what is the role of the ecology in structuring the value chain. So for example, because the sea is more seasonal, because you have booms and busts of the main pelagic species, because climate change is affecting fisheries a lot more, because there's a lot more competition of Goan, Kerala, Gujarat, boats at sea, maybe it structures big capital in a different way. While shrimp is more monoculture, more plantation, more standardized, it's more controlled. And so accumulation is a little bit easier, and therefore maybe you have big capital. And I'm trying to see whether, labor ecology influences how value chains get structured, which obviously will come in time. But that's the hypothesis of one is working towards.
Yeah, that's. I hope you come up with all this. 3 years of data you're telling you have?
No, my field work was 1 year. So most of my second year and a bit of my third year was spent data collection. My first year was coursework, writing up the research plan, coming up with who you were going to interview guides, things like that. It had to be approved through the university at the end of the first year. You present it to a panel, etc. And then your second year, once you've been approved, you can start your field work. So yeah, it's been
on a
mostly.
lighter note, how it is there in the university when you go back? How is the environment there? Like PhD scholars, I think many of the PhD scholars of Indian institutes would agree the amount of pressure they have and stress they have. On a lighter note, how it is there when you go back with the data? How is your relationship with your guide, and how is the
Yeah, I
environment?
mean, I again, I'm an outlier over there because I have fortunately ended up with two of the most kind, understanding, and available guides that one could hope for. And so I think 80-90% of the tension of what do you do with data, where do you go, of feeling directionless and rudderless is taken care by them. So, even I was in Karnataka recently and I was having a little bit of trouble with sticking to my research plan because of just how different it is to do interviews with boat owners, etc. They quickly organized a call. We got online, had a chat with them. So I'm very, very thankful to them for being there and handling all of that. Interestingly, again, I think, so I'm at the School of Business and Management, but there's a cluster inside of that that's called Business and Society, which basically looks at interactions of business with society and social relations. And within that, there's a smaller cluster on labor and ecology. So I have also a peer group of about 15-20 people, some in their PhDs, some postdocs, some junior lecturers, who all in their work, some with electric cars in Germany, somebody else with carbon credits and accumulation in Colombian forests, somebody else with financialization of social services in Brazil, somebody else with workers in Indonesia and the tuna industry. So everybody is kind of working towards something that connects labor and ecology as a central part. And I think it's really good because there's a peer group that helps you make sense of what's happening, and you don't only have to rely on your guides as well. So I think it was good to also have known my guide and to have spoken through this process of where I was going. Because I know in the same university, in the same cluster, somebody else who's been randomly assigned a guide after
Yeah.
applying has a very different experience because just because they don't know the guide, they didn't know where they'd be getting into, they didn't have any information, it works out quite differently for them.
Yeah. So I think equation with your guide always matters. Doesn't matter which part of the world you are. And you find yourself lucky you knew your, I think, guide during your master's. So
Yeah,
quite helpful. Yeah. Coming back to
definitely.
your research. So you were telling your work is qualitative. So you look, for example, in Karnataka side, so you look all different kinds of variety of fishery they are getting, is it?
Um, so it's, I mean, there is some element of that, but it's mainly to speak to people, which is to think about what do they do generally in their business. So
Okay.
let's say somebody says, I have 4 boats. Why do you have 4 boats? If there's a famine, like this year, people have been saying there's a fish famine, but there was like a deep decline in fish. So what do you do with your 4 boats, for example? Do you park one? Do you tie up 2, 3? Um, fish have seasonal cycles. So, for example, sardines will boom in 1 year, then they won't come back the next year. Suddenly, mackerel will boom, then they won't come back the next year. This year, anchovies haven't come back, but they all have markets that they supply to. So when that happens, they've got loans, they've got workers that they have to pay. So what do they do with seasonality? Because somebody has to bear the cost of this fluctuation. So it's kind of to look at what are people doing to remain competitive in the seafood industry. I've also spoken to people who've left the business to say, I just couldn't compete. It was too much for me. I sold all my boats and now I just do some trading. So why did they leave? What were the elements? And that reveals things like which networks people access. Why are they able to remain competitive? Who do they take loans from? Why are some players bigger than other players? Why do they decide to supply to a particular market? And I think it was more qualitative in that way rather than just looking at the fish species. It was to looking at why people do what they do and who they interact with in their way of doing business.
Okay, yeah, completely understood now. So is it like the way you are telling, I'm getting this impression, is it for small people in the sense that if they don't have much to input a big amount of money, so for them it's very hard to survive in fishing industry. Is that to survive when things are not correct, some if they are not getting good catch, so for the small scale fisheries it's very hard to survive there, is it?
I mean, so I again was not looking at small scale fishery, though I did meet small scale fishers cooperative societies and all, but it was more to understand the impact that they were facing from the trawl industry. And it was to also then speak to the trawl industry because I have realized that, very often we have very, boat owners are bad. And it's fine for somebody who's a small scale fisher who's directly affected by somebody from their village who owns 10 boats to say a trawler is bad, a trawl boat owner is bad. I think if you are from somebody who's from the city, somebody who's middle class, somebody who's upper caste, it's very different to have that same blame game going on, because I think you miss the dynamics of why people do what they do. Of course, we live in an economy in which everything is extractive. And so the idea was to then get beyond just that narrative that boat owners are depleting the oceans, to understand why they were depleting it, whether there were certain drivers of competitiveness that were driving them to do certain things, What could be the ways in which, in their own opinion, some of these pressures could be reduced? Because obviously they know that they are competing in a fishery that's in decline, and yet they find themselves unable to extract themselves, because what's the alternative? And so it was to try and understand whether they had alternatives. So some people have diversified, right? They've bought land, they've gone into seafood processing. So fishing is not so important for them. But the more you go down the value chain, it's always that if it's a triangle, the maximum number is producers, and then there's one or two lead firms, main players at the top. And so not everybody can have that mobility. And that again depends on certain ways of connections, alliances, social location, and business strategy. Who does what to get up there? And so it was to try and then look at what was happening to producers who were unable to get out. And they were not necessarily going out, but it was also, credit cycles, buyback arrangements, certain kinds of gears, certain kinds of alliances with other actors, certain kinds of industry groups, certain kinds of cooperative societies. And so all of these are affected by, I can't afford to go out of business. What do I do? And since it was a degree in business strategy, it was trying to get at examining those things.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I think once I've looked through my data and theoretically developed it a bit more, I'll definitely have a lot more clarity. But that's again where what my kind of interview guide did. It was a set of questions trying to understand some of these things, fishing seasons, fishing fluctuations, as a result of that labor organization, as a result of that relationship with the government, as a result of that which markets they supply to. So, in people's own words, try and get an understanding of their challenges, opportunities, but also strategies, what they were doing.
Okay. So, anyways, I think your outputs will be worth reading. What is going on here, at least in these two coasts, east, west, south of India.
I hope it is. I definitely would. As I write up, I want to think about avenues where it's not academic papers, because as I said, I didn't go into academia wanting to write academic papers or pursue a career in academia. It was purely to study a group that had very little literature on it, and so one hopes that there's multiple outputs that one can think about and engage with as it comes out.
I was about to ask a different question, but as you just mentioned about academia and all, so it just popped in my head. So, what are you actually looking after this one? Like, are you thinking to go in academia, or maybe some other thing? Like at present, what you think of your?
Yeah, definitely not academia. I think British. Sorry.
What typical like that, uncle kind of question. So, आगे क्या करना चाहते हो?
I don't know. I'm keeping myself open. I think my entire career trajectory has been changing every 3, 4, 5 years over the last 15 years. And so I definitely want to do something steady. I think at 41, I don't want to anymore hop around and do different things. I think the fish workers movement, definitely being a part of it and hoping that the biggest impact of this goes into organizing and strategies and movement building. In what capacity and how I will be doing that, I think that's up for a question that I have for myself. I think academia in the UK is very competitive. I think as a younger person, somebody who's 25, 26, under 30, completing a PhD, doing a postdoc, and then going on, I think it's worth it. I think at 42, finishing a PhD and then trying to become a lecturer and a professor, it's just not for me, because the wages it's too competitive. It's too, I don't think I'd be able to, and neither am I that interested. So I don't know really what I'd be doing after this, but I hope that as I begin to see an end for my PhD, I'll be able to think a little bit more deeply. But I think I would want to continue doing work that engages with the seafood industry. Having now done this for 3 years and 4 years by the time I finish, I want to see change and engagement at that level as well, towards sustainability, towards working conditions of workers, towards really shifting the seafood industry in that direction, using, again, the experience of the PhD, but also the position of where I am in society, to be challenged and to be in that group engaging with the seafood industry. Yeah.
It will be amazing to see Captain Siddharth, Dr. Siddharth, and I think Tanisha wanted to ask. Tanisha, you were about to
Because
ask something?
this is slightly, I'm not very well versed in this field. So who owns these trawlers? These are like middle class people, mostly, like, because you're saying that they have financial challenges uh, which force them to sometimes move out, and like basically who owns these trawlers, what kind of challenges they face, particularly in the context of say climate change or
Um, I'll give a short answer to that for two reasons. One, I know we are getting over time, almost 15 minutes over in case people. And the second thing is, because it's part of my PhD research, I'd rather it come out after I've like written it up and it's done, because it's also new information. I mean, I was one of the first people that they were ever meeting who had come to speak to them, both on shrimp farms. And both, shrimp farmers say they end up getting quantitative yes/no survey questions. But nobody really sits down and talks to them for an hour, hour and a half. And with boat owners as well, a lot of them, they're just speaking to fishery surveyors, asking about census and landing data, if at all, but really somebody asking them. So it was, I think the boats are not owned by big corporations. I'll say that. There is this understanding that big companies own trawlers and there are corporations at sea. That's not the case. There's a mix of people who own boats. There's also traditional fishers who own boats. There's also local trading communities and people who've worked in the Gulf and who've come back from the Middle East and invest money. There's also people who are traditional fishers who in the 70s had a wooden trawler, then in the 90s made a small steel trawler and have slowly upgraded as the industry has upgraded. And so it's hard to exactly put a label on who owns the boats. There's no one group. There's multiple ways of owning boats, and that reflects in how many boats they own. So there's definitely a spectrum of different kinds of people who own boats. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now, if that's okay.
like it would be wrong to say that these boats are by default harmful, like for the
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a difficult question to respond. Of course, they're harmful. I mean, Devashish is here. He's a small-scale fisher. I've spent many hours in his village, many hours seeing the state of what small-scale fishers are. And definitely destructive mechanized fishing gears are the primary reason for the decline of small-scale fishers. Whether it is big capital and the greed of trawl owners who are leading to that decline, I think that's a question that maybe, in my opinion, is a little bit, could be answered differently. And I think that's where I'm hoping to take my PhD, which is to respond to some of these questions, but also where can one meaningfully engage with, not from the small scale fish workers perspective. I think, they have their perspective. It's very important that they have their perspective. I think they provide a political direction that's very important for all of us, almost as a philosophy of how we should interact with the sea. But I think positionality wise, it would be very hard for me to take that case and say that that's what things need to be. I find it hard to say it, especially because many aspects of my life are very exploitative, and I would find it very hard to give it up. And so I find it very hard to, in my position again, say that, so and so needs to happen and they need to go. Yes, they need to go. But what is our trajectory of transitioning away from destructive fishing gears? I'm not so sure that I have an answer for that, or most of us have an answer for that. I think it's a matter that has a very clear political direction, but a very difficult practical response, because again, it's tied up in so many things.
That answers the question. And in between, like I still have a question, but I would say if anyone in our audience, if they have any doubts or question, or they wanted to ask anything from Siddharth, they can chip in and go ahead with their questions if they have. And yeah, I wanted to ask, till then I'm asking a question to Siddharth. You can put in the chat box, or you can directly switch on your camera and you can ask him directly. I wanted to ask, once you have been asked that, what's your take on the vastness of sea and the amount of, resources it carries? Then you answered, as vast as it may look, but every inch of it is mostly is explored as far as fisheries is concerned. We map an area, and then we go there, we exploit, then we finish the resources there, then we go ahead, we exploit, we finish it, and so on and so forth. We keep on moving. And as you have also mentioned, like we are not even leaving Antarctica, one of the pristine places. We think it's untouched, and we say it's untouched continent and all, and we are very much aware that how different countries are, fighting to get the resources in Antarctica waters. So, what's your take on Indian fisheries? What do you think? What's the fishery resource status in our waters, if you have any idea? And what would you comment on that? The, how about our fishery resources? Do you think they are towards that phase, reaching there, exploiting, and we are just exploiting and just choking it out? What would say, what would you say?
Um, I mean, I think uh, so. It's very similar, right? Like until a few years ago, the maximum and sustainable yield of Indian fisheries, as per the scientists, was some 3.5 million tons. Then it became 4 million tons. Now, it's at 5.3 million tons. And the more survey you do, the more fishery you find on one side. The second thing is the more fishery you find, the more markets develop to be able to make it into a commodity. So, for example, um, a lot of the low value bycatch is not juvenile fish, it's not pelagic fish, it's deep sea demersal or bottom resources. And a lot of that had no use. But now you have the fish meal, fish oil industry, which converts all of that. And what would have rotted, and I mean, according to their own words, what would have rotted, they give it a 2-year shelf life and it can grow shrimp and, all of this fish. So it definitely now, just this couple of weeks ago in the parliament, standing committee report to the Department of Fisheries, it was like, what is the state of Indian fisheries? And they're like, well, we've discovered 5.3 million tons. Currently, we are at 3.9 million tons. So we are developing deep sea fisheries resources to tap into the 1.3 million tons that is remaining. So according to the science, there is always more resources to exploit. That's on one side, and that's the state of Indian fisheries. I think what is important is to then look at sustainability, not just ecologically, but what if it was 5.3 million tons sustainability? Even if it was sustainably harvested, where is the value distribution of the 5.3 million tons? So 60% of the marine fishing community lives under the poverty line, which is way higher than the incidence of poverty at a national average. So definitely, incidence of poverty in marine communities is much, much higher. By and large, small-scale fishers or traditional fishers don't own boats. If they do own boat, it will be one boat, and they most likely will be an advantage because they don't have the same kind of linkages to be able to successfully profit off the fishery. So even if it's ecologically sustainable, it's socially unsustainable. The second thing is any fishery is regionally specific. So, for example, 86% of this MSY, that is, or the maximum sustainable yield that is calculated, is in the continental shelf. So, in the first 100 meters of depth, and that is because India's ecosystem has mountain ranges, lots of rivers that run in, lots of estuarine regions. So most fish harvesting most fish breeding and abundance happens in the first 50 meters, about 70%. And then in the 100 meters depth, this is not distance, but depth. And most of these waters, barring some parts of the coastline in, let's say, northern Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, are well within the access of motorized boats. So you could continue to have 4 million tons, but you could have that effort completely taken by motorized boats, for example. It needn't be bottom trawlers. It needn't be mechanized first seamers, which again are heavy capital. So, for example, a motorized boat costs 8 lakh rupees to build. A mechanized trawler costs 1.5 crores to build. And a mechanized first seamer costs 2.3 crores to build. So, then their operating cost, their fuel cost, there's a huge difference. So, in the cost of one mechanized trawler, you could have about 600 motorized boats. And that means 600 households that are able to take. So I think the difference between capital in that degree is huge. And so I think that's the state of Indian fisheries. On one hand, it's not MSY, but what is that MSY for? If it's low value bycatch that becomes fish meal, fish oil, that feeds a carnivore like a shrimp, that gets taken and exported abroad for American consumers, what use is that MSY for? It's a question to ask. And the second thing is, even if that fishery was sustainable, it's socially very inequitable and it's not distributed evenly. So then that is that question to ask about who is that nutritional security for? What is the direction of harvesting for the sea? Who, benefits from it, not just monetarily, but also in terms of diets, nutrition, livelihoods, and other social kind of acts that come out of the fishery. So, and then the larger question, of course, is the global inequality, which we can't forget. So, Spanish and European and Chinese subsidized boats are in the Indian Ocean, not reducing their tuna quotas, fishing a tuna stock that's well overfished. Skipjack and yellowfin tuna in the Indian Ocean is well overfished. And yet there is a scramble. India does not get a quota of it. So, there's also the global inequality within which we have to see India as a nation state. And then we also have to see the regional specificity of what's happening. And, try and find a position that is between both of that is globally just, but is also socially and regionally just. It doesn't stop at the nation state level, but comes down to the ground of the fishery where it's operating.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. And also with that, as you mentioned, the maximum sustainable yield and this one. So I wanted to ask one thing to you. What's your take on this? The amount of, increasing population, although fortunately it is decreasing in some part of the world. And with this increasing, climate change and global warming, which certainly affects fishery in one way, including exploitative fishery that affects again the, amount of fishery we get. So is it possible for this growing demand and population for satisfy all this number of people with a sustainable way of doing fishing? Is it really possible, or there is no other way than going for exploitative? What would be your take on that?
I mean, my take on that is that unsustainable fisheries doesn't happen because there is a food deficit. I think unsustainable fisheries happens because there is market competition that drives people to compete to remain, or they'll be out of the business. And I think the dynamics of capitalism and capital work in that manner. You either compete and live, or you die out and exit the market. And I think there is very little of that narrative that has got to do with actual hunger, because if it was, we'd be radically rethinking how we catch the 4.3 million tons of fish that we are currently catching, especially thinking of the markets, the species, where it goes to, etc., and the whole outlook. So I think, I think hunger is not, and again, hunger is not so much about population. Hunger is again an outcome of distribution. There is an abundance of food. There is an overproduction of food. There is definitely an overproduction of certain kinds of food in certain parts of the world. So, for example, beef, pork, chickens in Northern America, for example, are in overproduction. They are extremely intensive in terms of the carbon emissions that they give out. And there is a distribution problem. Black Americans, working class Americans, Latina migrants are hungry in America in spite of having 5,000 calories of food per person, when the requirement is 1,800 for an average woman and 2,100 for a man, even for Indian conditions. So I think again, hunger is a distribution and an inequality problem, not really a production problem. And I think markets and institutions and social conditions that create hunger are where the answer lies, not really thinking about unsustainable fishing because of population. I think, we keep getting that in every government, every narrative to say that we are a poor country, we have malnourishments, and therefore we must have trawlers. I think it's not true. That's not the right way to think about it at all. I can understand why technocrats and all think like that because our science works like that. But I think there are alternate ways to think about it as well.
Oh, a nice take-home message, I would say, at the end. So I can go on asking questions.
No, I
So
think
deeply, uh, but I would say if anyone is having, they can please can ask.
Yeah, I'll quickly respond. Maybe in the next 5-7 minutes we'll try and wind up, but I'll try and respond in the meantime to Swarna Prabha's question, which says, do you think your future going a certain way, or do you just go with the flow, and how do you do what you do? When it's a great question, and I think my answer would be very different if I was younger, which would have been to say that I used to just go with the flow. And I really did jump, and I had a family that was supportive. I mean, I know my mother's here and she's been listening, but I was never, and my sister's been very supportive, and I lost my father early in life, so the three of us have been quite close, and I think it was their support that really just helped take the leap when I needed a change, to know that there was a place to come back to and reevaluate. And so I think part of it was having support mechanisms, not just from them, also friends and some partners, etc., in the past, and so it was helpful. um, but I think at the other side, as an older person, I think it's also very important to put that into the context of where I lie in terms of privilege. I mean, I do come from a family that, I mean, I went to a private school, I got an English education, I am Brahmin, I have a certain surname. There are always social connections that come out. And so jumping for me also comes from having that base, which I think it's important to acknowledge, that it's not just some romantic idea of like jumping and being able to do it on my own. There is part of wanting to do things and not be stuck. And there is also the opportunity that was provided that was outside of me. So I think I wish more people could do. I mean, I think, Dr. Ambedkar's words don't apply to me, of course, but as a philosophy, if every human could live to their most potential, unshackled from the caste system as he wanted to, and fought for Dalits in that manner, I think it would be great that everybody had the conditions to do what they could do. But the truth is that everybody can't, and only a small group of people can. And I am one of those small group of people who's gone around the world, have been in that position to make it about myself on Instagram, social media posts. I've gained popularity because of that as well, and then have kind of like dramatically reevaluated. So I think there is a certain kind of disposition to not be tied down. And I think that is just, some people like routine and some people like to be in certain spaces, and I don't. And part of it, so I think I would respond to it like that. And then there's Reno's question about, have you thought about writing a book about your life's journey? Similar question. I don't think so. I think like my life is not unique. I mean, in the sense, it's just that we are interacting and it sounds unique, but there are people doing all kinds of unique things. And I think there are, yeah, I mean, I don't consider it important enough, or I don't consider my story important enough that I feel like I need to dedicate time to writing a book about it. If that will change in the future, I don't know, but not at the moment. I think there are more interesting people who should write stories about their life, which I think we can all learn from and enjoy reading, not another person writing a book about their life, who obviously, as I said, had the way to write it. And so it would be interesting to write about the travels, but I don't think I have the narrative or the manner in my head to write it in a way that I would like it to turn out. And so right now I'm not thinking about it.
Maybe just right now. Who knows the future?
I'll just ask one thing. This is very unrelated to the kind of topics we covered. You worked like during COVID, you worked a lot with fish worker unions, right? Uh, on the issues that they faced during the lockdown. Could you just
Yeah.
talk about that? Because we have forgotten that as a country, the kind of, you know.
4 years since, actually, exactly.
And
So
we
it
need
was not so much.
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, we need to remind ourselves of the kind of situations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was not so much with fish worker unions or small scale fish worker unions as much, because actually the interesting thing is that COVID actually shut down most of the country, and with it, most interstate and global trade. And so mechanized boats were the ones that really shut down. So small scale fish workers, as I know from Devashish and talking to him, then, fish actually came back closer to the shore. Fishers were able to supply their local markets. They had fresh fish in abundance. And even for the year after that, there was such a big relief of mechanized fishing pressure in the sea that actually there was an abundance in fishery that happened for small scale fish workers. And so we didn't do much work with small scale fish worker unions, other than the fact that where there were strict lockdowns and people couldn't go fishing, there was an complete loss of livelihood. And so providing of livelihood compensation was the main work that we tried to do. I think the main work that we did was with migrant fish workers. And so that was another part of the industry that was not known as much, that almost the entire West Coast, mechanized boats, ice plants, vending, cutting, transportation, processing plant, surimi plant, fish meal, fish oil plant, all the workers are migrant workers. And they all come from the East Coast, West Bengal, Odisha. A lot of them come from the tribal areas of Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha. And all of them have, in the last 5-7 years, moved to work in this industry. And a lot of them, interestingly, because of fisheries being very disconnected from land, right? Like if you're a construction worker, of course, your work is hard, but you live in a site, you know where your kirana shop is, you know where the ration shop is, you know where the chai shop is, you know where the bus stand is. A migrant fisher literally gets off the train, gets picked up by the agent and stays on the boat for 10 months and then goes back home. Because the cycle is you come home, you offload fish, you load ice, you repair the net, and you go back to sea. And so when the lockdown happened, people just were unfamiliar with the geography of where they were. And so it was a very different experience, a very disorienting experience for migrant fish workers, especially of the fish work, of the other migrant workers, because of their disconnection to where they were. And the second thing was because of the geographies that they come from. When the lockdown happened, it wasn't that they could just go home. The only way to get back to Jharkhand or Orissa from Goa or from Karnataka is to go to Bombay, then from Bombay go to Raipur or Jharsuguda, then from Jharsuguda take a bus or a rickshaw and go to the biggest city of your district, and then take a local bus and go home. While if you're from West Bengal, not that it's easy to get home, but there are direct trains that run from Kerala to Howrah, and then you get home to Malda or South 24. Also, you are much more connected. And so it also became quite interesting for a particular group of the tribal workers, because again, unfamiliarity, unhospitable geographies of coming from, and then the caste system. Adivasis are looked upon as backward, they are looked upon as, somebody who can be easily exploited. So they were thrown out of their houses, out of their boats, they're just hanging out on the road. And it was quite bad. Like in Goa, where I was based at the moment, things were horrible. People were being chased down the road with sticks because they were looking for food. 6 people, I've helped people, the Jharkhand government, embalm the bodies of people who had died on the road and have them flown back to Jharkhand on a plane because their family wanted the bodies back. We've gone to the morgues and identified bodies. This was the worst case scenario. Obviously, it wasn't. There were people who were tied up in chains. There was one Adivasi who was tied up because he was roaming around in the village, drunk a little bit. And the villagers were like, okay, he's an Adivasi. So they just left him in the rain and tied him with chains that they used the cows overnight. And we had to go in the morning and get him out of there. So obviously the lockdown was a horrible case for a lot of people and for the migrant fish workers. And we have forgotten. I mean, not only have we forgotten in our imagination, things have pretty much gone back to as they were. There hasn't been much change in the way working experiences of workers are in the industry. They still are quite precarious.
Thank you. Thank you. It was so good listening to you.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was really amazing. And on a closing note, I would say thank you so much. I think, have gone through the full journey from your starting till what you're doing at present, and lots of insights for giving lots of insight. And thank you for giving your time. And thank you everyone who joined here. And this page is there, AurKitnaPadhoge, where we try to talk to someone like Siddharth, who is having this big, ocean of knowledge to share with others. So again, thank you so much, Siddharth, for coming here and sharing your whole experience, which is priceless. So yeah.
No, thanks to both of you as well for reaching out, for organizing this, for having an hour and 40-minute long chat. Thanks to Aditi for putting us in touch. Thanks to everybody else who stayed for 1 hour, 40 minutes and listened. Thanks to Devashish, who's been a guide and a friend for a long time, who's joined and listened in as well, in spite of being a very busy man. Thanks to my mother, who's also listened. I'm probably going to get a WhatsApp message from her after this. So that'll be fun to see. And yeah, I mean, it's always nice to have a long chat and reflect on your own life. So it's like quite a nice moment to think about a lot of your life as well.
Thank you. Some of your questions answered my questions also.
It was like I was going through that journey, like in last 1 hour 40 minutes. I think for me, from my soul's perspective, I think I have been through all what you were explaining. So it gave me the it is like I lived that journey you have been through. So
that
thanks
cannot be a better compliment than that. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. See you, everyone. Oh, Devashish is saying bye, or he